Teachers, what was the worst child abuse or neglect case you've had? Story 1. This isn't necessarily the worst, but it definitely keeps me up at night. We have a family at my school that we've called CPS on numerous times. Kids are still with their parents, but we keep calling. The kids have told us we're not allowed to talk about home to you when we ask about things. If that's not sketchy, I don't know what is. The kids all look malnourished. Pasty white skin, dark circles under their eyes, just hollow looking. I don't know how else to describe it. One of them never stops talking, and we know it's because no one will listen to them at home. They all have behavior issues or anger problems, and we know it's because of the examples they see at home. Parents won't sign consent forms to talk to our school therapist because he's a mandatory reporter. At summer school last year, one of them asked me if they could go get a drink of water. It was the end of the day, and I said no because parents could be there any minute, and drinking fountains weren't close by. I told her she could get a drink when she got home. They'd also just finished lunch with juice, milk, etc. She looked at me and said, "They won't let me get a drink when I get home." I knew she wasn't lying, so I sent her. None of them are allowed to read books at home because a year or two ago, one of them colored in a book and none of the kids would admit to it. So, no reading for them. This has been confirmed by parents even. The kids are dying to read, so we assign them reading for homework so they can. One of them asked my colleague if she would up their reading minutes so they could read more at home. She obviously happily obliged. We've heard their parents pick them up by their heads and scream and swear in their faces. As soon as they get home from school, they all get locked in their rooms. On the weekends, they're locked in their room the majority of the time. Because they usually get fed something, nothing has been done about that by CPS. They're not allowed to use the furniture in their living room. They have to sit on the floor. Last year, we fed them all before we sent them home for the day because we were never sure if they'd get dinner. And it wasn't because food wasn't available. It's seriously heartbreaking. And it's really sad to know we've done as much as we can, but our hands are tied. So to try and make things better for the kids, we offer them every single after-school activity and program we can. We try to give them as much of a break from home as we possibly can. I still worry it's not enough. Story 2. Before starting my studies to become a teacher, I worked in a kindergarten. Among the kids were a girl and her younger brother, aged 5 and 4 respectively. They were both very sweet kids, though we had some minor behavioral issues with the brother, who was paralyzed from his waist down and was in a wheelchair. Anyways, one day I'm eating with the kids, shooting the crap about Legos and Star Wars, when the brother refuses to eat his lunch. After some failed attempts at convincing him to eat, I ask him, "But Abdi, what would your dad say when you won't eat your food?" Little Abdi just shrugs and, as casual as I've ever seen, says, "Nothing, he just beats me." I was shocked, and pretty immediately wrote down our interaction and took it to my boss, who informed me they had already opened an investigation with CPS about the abuse the two were experiencing at home. She then told me further details about what had been uncovered. The kids lived alone with their father, a very nice and respectful man who I liked very much and had many nice talks with. Apparently, however, that didn't stop him from beating his kids with a cane, locking them in closets, and burning them with lighter or irons. Can't remember specifically. Mother Lover was torturing his own children in an attempt to discipline them. His 4-year-old paralyzed son. For some reason, the case was taking a while, as CPS were trying to educate the father and make their family work. The abuse was infrequent, and at the end of the day, I had to hand them over to him when he came to pick them up. I wanted to end his life, and I felt like crap for knowingly letting them return to that environment. Both kids were eventually taken away from their dads and put into an excellent foster home on a farm, where they've progressed wonderfully from what I've heard. Also, I got to testify against the father during the trial against him afterwards. It still bothers me how nice the dad was. He seemed loving with his kids, and not in a deliberate way, and treated everyone with respect. I met him several times outside of work and never got any bad vibes from him. Apparently, old habits from Pakistan carried over. I've definitely been more alert about this stuff since then. My abusive mother worked at school with me. Everyone loved her. Nobody thought a dang thing about me. I don't know if I wish they did, because I'm terrified of what would have happened to me. but I'm just lucky to be able to look back and say that. The way CPS is described in both of the above stories is actually unusual for Reddit. In a lot of Reddit stories, an OP will pose a question like, "Am I a jerk for calling CPS on my sister?" They then proceed to tell a story about as horrific as the ones above, to where it comes across as disingenuous that they would be asking if they were the jerk. It usually seems like they want to be seen as the hero. What they actually tend to seem like is a liar, because those stories always end with CPS swooping in and taking the kids to foster care with zero investigation. But these stories swing to the other end of the spectrum completely. They investigated, but did nothing because the abuse wasn't frequent enough. And if that was the case in this story, you have to wonder how bad the abuse got for them to finally step in. Having known people who had interactions with CPS, the deliberate blind eye they turned to abuse here doesn't ring true. But it may also vary wildly by area. In any case, if you ever do encounter a situation like this, never feel like your hands are tied. You know what they say about the squeaky wheel. Don't let a child suffer because it seemed like your efforts weren't going anywhere. Fight until you drop. The next story may or may not be a prime example, depending on how you choose to believe it ends. Story 3. Had a little girl who was displaying extreme signs of abuse and neglect. She was already removed from care from her parents, and she lived with her grandmother and step-grandfather. We called CPS on them, and weeks later, we get a very angry call from the grandmother. The CPS worker came to our house and told them my name and pretty much word for word what I reported. The grandmother was demanding that I was to be fired. The principal set up a meeting with the grandparents, the board social worker, the school therapists, our classroom team, and the CPS worker. 99.9% of the time, I am fully on board with CPS and have a lot of respect for what they do. But this worker was a complete moron. We worked things out with the grandparents, and thankfully my principal stood by me. The grandparents left, and the CPS worker said she didn't see anything that was worth investigating. All the people from the board were like, "What the heck is wrong with you? Do you not see all the red flags? This little girl needs help." The CPS worker said she would keep the case open, but insisted that her report would say it was resolved at a school level. A few weeks later, the step-grandfather died suddenly, and the little girl was struggling. She came to school with no food, dirty, reeked like pee, and was constantly playing with her private parts. We called CPS again, and they said they closed their file and were done with the family. We had an emergency meeting again, and we started to put a bunch of things in place to support her at school. Giving her meals, clothes, washing her face and hair, and giving her a lot of love. The social worker for the board went to CPS and fought to get the case open again. As soon as it was opened again, Grandma moved 6 hours away with the little girl to move in with her new boyfriend. This was less than 2 months after the death of her husband. We sent all the info to the new school board and called CPS in that area, but because we are out of bounds, they won't tell us anything. I pray every day for that little girl. Story 4. Teachers are mandated reporters of child abuse. It wasn't my class, but since I traveled to different schools in Brooklyn, I keep my eyes out for anything unusual. A little boy had the worst eczema I had ever seen. His arms were raw and red, and the skin was peeling off. When I asked the teacher about it, she said his mom has medication for that, but she doesn't put it on. The little boy was also wearing dirty clothes, no backpack, and his hair was a tangle. We talked to the principal of the school, and she said she would call the mom herself, but not to call it in. Once you call ACS, Administration for Children's Services, it can really damage the relationship with the parent and family, of course. It's not anonymous, and they always tell the family the name of the reporter. 1 week later, I'm back at the school, and it's the worst case of neglect I've seen. The school gave him clean clothes last week, and he was still wearing the same uniform shirt stained with a week of food and dirt. The school made a chart for his mom to remind her twice a day to apply the cream for his eczema. But the new backpack with the chart was also gone. He was very quiet and hungry, so the teachers would let him eat as much as he wanted, and they sent him home with little bags of pretzels and fruit. So I called ACS because I don't see the parents every day, and they probably don't know me. What bothered me most were his arms and legs, when you could see the blood from the extreme untreated eczema. I've never seen anything like it. Well, when I called, they said there was already a case open, and the family was living in temporary housing, a shelter. Their caseworker knew about everything I said and wouldn't take their report. They said a social worker was already assigned, but I didn't see any evidence of that. The next time I visited the school, the child was gone because his mom had discharged him from the school. I can only hope that she received the help she needed to take care of that sweet little boy. While this OP's optimism is admirable, it sounds like the issue wasn't as simple as the mother needing help taking care of him. Poverty was clearly an issue, but unless she was working too many hours to ever see the boy, then their financial circumstances don't really explain why she wasn't applying his medication. They also don't explain why the social worker was doing anything. It's disheartening to see so many stories of neglect coming from child advocates in addition to parents and guardians. Not simply because it means there are people in those positions who shouldn't be there, but because it leads to the fear that people will read all these stories in one go and assume that asking these services for help is a waste of oxygen. It's not. Plenty of incredibly passionate people enter these fields. Not reaching out to the appropriate services or authorities when you witness abuse or neglect is like refusing to call the cops when you've been robbed because you've heard some bad stories about corruption or plain ineffectiveness. Reaching out won't guarantee a positive result, but failure to do so will guarantee a negative one. Story 5. Not the kind of abuse most would think of, but still horrible for the kid regardless. I was teaching a consumer economics class to seniors in high school, and we were learning about credit scores. One of the students raised their hand and asked if having bad credit would prevent you from being able to open a bank account. After some additional questioning, I found out the student was inquiring because she had just turned 18 and didn't understand why she was being turned down from her local bank. I realized she had no prior knowledge of credit or banking, so I asked her to first speak with her parents, and then told her I could help her get a credit report. Well, as it turned out, her parents were honest with her as soon as she inquired. They had sold her information to her mother's best friend to use to open numerous utility accounts and who knows what else when their daughter was 14, completely destroying and defrauding her credit. According to them, they had done nothing wrong, because they claimed they asked her and bought her a new pair of sneakers in return for her permission. I had to spend the next week with her and the counselor on the phone with police, as well as credit bureaus trying to begin the long and arduous process of restoring her credit. The worst part is she was a kid who was walking a thin line between moving forward to college or taking the wrong path. When this happened, she moved out of her parents' house and in with her boyfriend and put off starting college because she was working to pay the rent. To this day, I don't know what ended up happening to her after graduating a couple months later. I can only hope that she followed through and was able to straighten everything out. No thanks to her crappy parents. This is actually happening to me right now. Mom used my info since I was 11, and I'm 17 now. I just had to give up going straight to college and everything. While the parents in these cases were absolutely terrible, it feels like there might be some fault on the part of the creditors that shouldn't be ignored. It might vary from one creditor to the next, but it seems like you should need quite a bit of info to open those sorts of accounts. It also seems like there should be an age limit, and certainly a much higher one than 11 or 14. If so, there's no way for this to happen without fudging the date of birth, which means that if a creditor did even the barest amount of verification before opening the account, the fraud should be discovered before it really amounts to anything. Perhaps I'm wrong and it doesn't work this way at all, but if it doesn't, then it should. If the laziest attempts at fraud can't be halted in their tracks, then the more experienced scammers must be able to bend these companies over a barrel. Story 6. Probably pretty mild compared to some here, but a kid I taught at 3 years old already showed signs of emotional abuse. For example, having a panic attack when we gave him a red chair because to him it looked pink, and he was a boy not allowed to have anything pink. One day, we saw a massive red and purple welt on his buttocks when we took him to the bathroom. We asked him about it, and he said, "Daddy did it," then got this look like he realized he'd fricked up. Throughout the day, he found excuses to explain to every adult he saw that he had fallen over, every time looking anxious as frick. The injury was bad, but worse was watching him try to mitigate the damage he had done by accidentally telling the truth. When his dad came to pick him up from daycare, he would cry hysterically and refuse to go to his dad's until someone physically took his hand and led him. It broke my heart one day when his name was called. He looked happy as a clam and walked to the classroom door. Then, as soon as he saw his dad, he stopped, his face fell, he started whimpering, and his bottom lip went. He backed away from the door, trying as hard as possible not to cry so his dad didn't beat him for being soft. Again, 3 years old. Edit: this was not in a Western country. Not USA, not New Zealand, where I'm from. In response to this and similar experiences, I came back to New Zealand, went back to uni, and am now in a position to rain heck on scumbags like the kid's dad. In my post, I used the word mild. That was absolutely a relative use of the word. This kind of abuse is frighteningly common where it took place. There was nothing I could do because the locals saw no problem with it, including the school administration, and I'm quite sure local law enforcement. Story 7. Worked in an English course school for very wealthy kids. There was this really tiny girl who was enrolled in our 3-year-old group. She was tiny even for a 3-year-old. Wealthy mom was always late to bring her. The girl always looked sleepy as heck and was always wearing weird clothes, like party dresses, as if the mom would just grab the first thing out of the girl's closet and make her wear it. Her hair was always a mess. Mom wouldn't pack her any snacks for break time, except for a freaking tube of Mentos mint. That's what the girl would eat. The following year, we found out that the girl was not really 3, but 5 years old. She was so small, she could pass as a 3-year-old and then some. Very thin limbs, poor balance. Mom had deliberately lied about the girl's age for God knows what reason. We suspect it was to hide the fact that the girl wasn't developing or growing properly, probably because Mom was too busy to feed her real foods. We had a positive reinforcement system for homework. Every time a student brought back homework that was done properly, they'd get a golden sticker. Once they got 10 of those, they could get a small toy. School merchandising, though they were actually really cute. Kids were always psyched about getting their prizes. Homework for kids that age was ridiculously simple, usually just a sheet of paper with a picture to color, or a connect the dots thing, a color by number, etc. Little girl would never bring her homework. We called Mom. She said it was too much homework, and she didn't have time to help the girl do it. Tried calling our equivalent of CPS, but much to my shock and dismay, they said they could only do something about it if the girl had bruises or marks of physical abuse. I crap you not. Then I stopped working there. I really wish I knew what happened to her and how she is now. The mother in this case certainly isn't ideal, but it should be pointed out that this OP also makes one or two pretty drastic assumptions. There are any number of reasons that a child isn't developing properly. It seems that this OP is leaping to the assumption that she wasn't fed simply because the girl ate Mentos at break time. But did anyone ever talk to the girl to see if maybe she just liked Mentos? Similarly, the bit about the party dresses might be a mother pulling whatever she sees first out of that closet, but if the mother is that uninvolved with what the child wears, then it's strange that she has party dresses in the first place. A girl wearing a party dress when there's no reason to sounds more like the kind of thing that happens when you let a child dress themselves. And I'm not saying that might not still be problematic, especially when paired up with the messy hair and the lack of help on her homework, but it's important to be careful about making assumptions when reporting a case like this. If CPS had investigated based on the claims in this post, anything that turned out to be untrue and based on a wild assumption might have biased them against the case altogether, whereas sticking only with what can be seen would prep them to go in looking for more info that a teacher wouldn't be able to guess at. Doesn't matter in this case since they didn't investigate anyway, but it's an important thing to keep in mind. Story 8. When I was training, we had a student that had been dipped in boiling water by his mom when he was a baby. Only part of him uninjured was his foot where she held him. Don't know how he survived. I also had a child who was now in a safe home, whose first memory was watching the sun rise and set on a box of crackers that he couldn't reach. In some ways, his story was worse than the first. He was not removed from that home until he was 4 or 5. The dad would force him to watch his mom being punished by brutally graping her, while this child was forced to watch. This kid was adopted from a family, but still talked fondly about fishing with his real dad. Thank goodness for the patience of adopted families who refused to give up on him no matter how often he tried to make them hate him. Saddest cases? To me, it is unintentional abuse. Had a first grader who couldn't see. Finally, the school was able to get this kid glasses. The glasses were easily an inch thick. He was so blind. I was looking forward to giving them to this boy the day they came in. He never came back to school. Moved yet again, third school in the first semester. No forwarding address, no school to send records and glasses to. Just sad. Obviously not the most serious case of neglect, but had a huge negative impact on this kid. Parents really didn't care about schooling enough to even get his records from his previous schools. Story 9. Oh Lord, I'm a new teacher, so it still surprises me when I see it. Two that I recall vividly, not strictly child abuse, but a messed up situation. It was a pre-intern in college teaching English to non-native speakers. I had the sweetest little first grader whose family was Cuban. We were doing a writing prompt about a time I was sick. And this little girl looks at me and, matter of fact, tells me about the time I hid under the table because the police were here and I vomited. I was so surprised, I didn't even know how to react and fumbled for a second. I was 20 and had never been in the classroom before. I eventually asked why the police came, and she told me because Mommy called them because Daddy left a big bruise on her arm. Luckily, I found out from my lead teacher that Dad was not in the picture anymore. I cried in my car after that day. Now I'm a first-year teacher in a middle school. I teach kids with autism, and their self-care isn't always great. I have some kids who come to school with the same shirt and pants for a week straight. In September, one of my kids had bed bugs for about a month straight. The thing about wearing the same clothes over and over makes me wonder if any of my old teachers suspected there was something wrong with me. I used to do that even up until high school. I had no energy for good hygiene and was suffering from untreated severe mental illness. I'm bending over backwards trying to figure out why the first girl's family being Cuban was in any way relevant. We know the students weren't native English speakers, so we guessed she was from somewhere else, but does it really matter where? That's the kind of thing that makes a lot of Redditors assume they're reading race bait, which I don't think is necessarily the case, since in those stories, the details are usually dramatically worse. But for some readers, it will hurt the credibility of the story to include an unnecessary detail like that. As for the second story, the repeat clothing might be poor self-care, but it also feels like the kind of thing a parent should notice. I know that 2022 is trying to move away from the concept of othering autistic people, but when they're still kids, you surely don't just expect them to completely take care of themselves without guidance, do you? If anyone in the comments has insight on this, then by all means, share it down below. Story 10. When I taught English in schools in Japan, there were these two siblings who were neglected and abused pretty badly. The oldest girl would come in with her hair matted and tangled, would complain of headaches and dizziness because she hadn't eaten anything since lunch the day before. White uniform shirt, black with dirt, teeth rotting and falling out. The school tried reaching out to her mom. Single mom, worked nights at a cabaret, leaving her kids alone to feed and bathe themselves. But it just got worse. CPS isn't really a thing there, and when kids get taken away, they always just get thrown into horrible group homes with rampant physical and sensual abuse. So the school started taking care of her, washing her uniform when she was in gym clothes, saving lunch to give her breakfast, combing her hair, washing her up in the nurse's office. Her younger brother started my last few months at the school, and he was just as neglected, but also physically abused by the mom's boyfriend, who thought he was useless and stupid, and said so in front of teachers and him constantly. We just tried to monitor if he had any bruises or injuries, but the school was still convinced they could educate the parents on how to be better. I don't know what happened to these kids, but I think about them constantly. Please like and subscribe if you've made it this far. I hope you'll enjoy the rest of this video and have a wonderful day. Story 11. The students I have tend to be well taken care of physically, but emotionally and mentally, they're not. We're trying to deal with huge percentages of students who have thoughts of self-harm, are highly anxious, and are not mentally healthy. I try to reach out to them all because it's so hard to know what's going on at home. I just hope that I can be a little ray of sunshine in their day, and they might feel comfortable coming to me if they need help or encouragement. Cases that pop to mind are the all too often 504 meeting, where a parent is saying in front of their child that the kid isn't trying hard enough, or he's broken in some way. The misunderstanding of mental health issues is common, but it's hard to hear a parent saying their child could choose to be a better student if they'd just try harder. The worst, the ones that make me cry, are the kids whose parents fill out my start of the year form, and when I ask what I should know about their child or why they're proud of them, they say they aren't proud, that their kid is a disappointment, that they can't wait for them to graduate and move out. It breaks my heart. I had one girl in a survey tell me that she just wanted to know for sure that her dad loved her. Story 12. I've posted this before, but I was a foreign English teacher working in South Korea. I taught a little girl from the time she was in 3rd grade to 6th grade. From the very beginning, it was obvious that she was malnourished and unloved at home. She was half the size of the other kids, always very dirty, constantly starving, and absolutely desperate for love. The Korean teachers all brushed it off that her dad was out of the picture, her mom was poor, and that her mom was also battling cancer. But to me, what made it obvious was that her 2 older sisters were well cared for and happy, but they wouldn't so much as look at their younger sister, despite both being really sweet girls. They were definitely brainwashed against her. I would say it was apparent things were out of control when the little girl's hair started falling out in clumps, and the hair that didn't fall out turned white at the roots. This is a 10-year-old I'm talking about. I did eventually go against my school's explicit instruction and report it, but Korea has a terrible system for child abuse, and she's still living in that home. I think about her every day. This is probably the most bizarre story here. I just don't understand why someone, even if they were poor, would favor some kids over the others. The biggest question isn't even necessarily why a person would favor some kids over the others, but rather who would have brainwashed them, which is a pretty huge leap on its own. Reddit itself is full of stories by OPs who passionately hate their siblings for practically no reason and will vent about them to the tune of thousands of upvotes. They'll be encouraged for things like refusing to share half a sandwich when a sibling drops theirs. If the only explanation we got for those girls turning a blind eye to their sister was that they were Redditors, I'd believe it, because if the dad is out of the picture, he's definitely not brainwashing those girls. That leaves the mom. But is hating her youngest daughter really a priority when she's battling cancer? And more importantly, what type of cancer? Even colon cancer can metastasize to the brain and affect a person's behavior. This girl's story is tragic if true, but it might not actually be a case of a parent setting out to be malicious. The real question is why there are no additional guardians or social workers on the scene when a single disease-ridden mother is raising 3 children. Korea does have social workers, right? In fact, I was under the impression that social service is compulsory if you don't qualify for military conscription. If that's accurate, they shouldn't even have a choice but to help this family. Story 13. I took a preschool experience lab all 4 years of high school, teaching and assistant teaching 3 to 5-year-olds from the area. By my senior year, I was essentially the head teacher. That year, we had a sweet little 5-year-old boy with oppositional defiant disorder. He only did what he wanted to and would pitch huge fits when he didn't get his way. The only way he would listen was if he had a certified interpreter from the special education department to show him pictures of the actions he should be following. That is, sitting down, listening, washing hands, etc. The actual teacher of the lab only had the interpreter come in once, which kind of made me mad. Needless to say, this little boy had a lot of incident reports sent home with him. One day, this little boy had such a huge outburst, his mother was called to pick him up early. One of my co-teachers overheard his mother tell him, "You're the man of the house. You need to act like a man. And if you don't get your act straight, I'm sending you back to shoddy daycare across town." To her 5-year-olds. My heart absolutely broke for that little boy that day. If his mom had the guts to tell him that in his preschool, I can't even imagine how she spoke to him at home. Story 14. A girl whose parents and siblings used her as a scapegoat, and their punishment for her was to whip her feet. They routinely whipped the skin from her feet to the point she was crippled. muscle, nerve, and bone damage. In care, she underwent several surgeries to be able to walk again, and now has severely scarred but usable feet. Lots and lots of unalive children from physical abuse, sensual abuse, neglect, ages 2 months to 18. Had a summer where parents kept dipping their babies into boiling oil for punishment. 2 didn't live. 1 boiled to the point he did not live, but had his arm amputated after being taken to the hospital by a family member. Others will be physically scarred for life. So much abuse cases, so many drug cases. In one case, the parents passed out, the toddler got out of the house and into the street and had its life ended as several cars hit him. Another newborn baby half eaten by the family's pet raccoon. Parents passed out in the same room, but so high they didn't respond to the screaming. This was just in one city in the southern U.S., where I was a worker in child welfare, CPS. Left last year after all the public pressure of, you just steal babies from loving parents. Bullcrap got to me. People seem to not recognize the horrors of child abuse and how crazy common it is. Story 15. I was a preschool teacher at a daycare. I worked in the toddler room just about every afternoon. There was this little boy who'd get dropped off as soon as we opened, 6:15, and often picked up an hour or 2 after we closed. We used to write the initials of the kids on their diapers to keep track of them. It was not uncommon for this little boy to get picked up late on a Friday night and get dropped off first thing Monday morning in the same diaper we put on him. We knew because of the initials on the diapers. It was not uncommon for me to wash this kid in the sink just to get the caked-off poop off of him. He constantly had open sores from sitting in filth for so long. We would constantly give him extra food when he was at school because we honestly didn't know if she fed him. We had CPS at the center at least 5 times for him. It was heartbreaking every single time. I got a job with a school district and stopped working at the center. I still think of that boy from time to time. It's been years since I've last seen him. I hope he's not with his mother, or if he is, she's treating him better. The worst part of this story is that unless there's a significant detail missing, you can't even really blame poverty for this one. I'm sure there's some magical country that offers free daycare, but the U.S. is not generally one of them, unless you're talking about some fairly specific charitable facilities. And given the reference to CPS, this does indeed appear to take place in the States. It's hard to imagine that a family would be working too hard to take care of their kids, yet still have enough money to put them in daycare. Then again, maybe daycare is the only option while the parents are at work, in which case they're working hard and still not making it. If that were the case, there's a chance they resent the child for the drain on their finances. It's hard not to feel for the boy. Even if his situation does get better, it'll probably just be because he finally got old enough to be a latchkey kid. Story 16. My student teaching year, a boy would go into the bathroom and roll his poop into little balls and line it all up in the bathroom. We later discovered, after reporting this, kids do this kind of stuff with their bowel movements as a way of control, that his uncle had been coming into his room at night and feeling him to see if he'd wet the bed. I have scars down my ankle from one student. She was taken off her antipsychotic meds by her mother, and we weren't told. Student would tell me she'd end my life, scoop out my eyes, watch me bleed in front of her, and laugh, peel off my skin, etc. One day she snapped and flipped her desk onto the back of my leg while I was writing something on the boards. This was first grade, by the way. Blood pooling around my foot. My students started freaking out, so I calmly sent them to the reading area while not taking my eyes off the girl, and called the principal. Later discovered that not only was she off her meds, but the freaking idiot mom was letting the 18-year-old cousin sleep with the little girl at night. Story 17. In high school, I would work in an elementary school to help kids with homework and other stuff. First couple months, it was no big deal, and then I got out with a couple special needs kids. More difficult, but it felt good to help them out. Until one day, this boy, we'll call him Frank, came in holding his arm. Now, Frank wasn't the smartest, but he was super nice and just wanted a friend. As we were starting our reading that day, I noticed Frank not being his normal self and started asking him if everything was all right. He told me his arm hurt, that he had hurt it at home last night. I looked at it and realized this kid has a broken arm. All day long, he had been walking around in agonizing pain, and when I asked him why he didn't say anything, he told me it was because his parents didn't want him to. Luckily, the nurse made his parents take him to the hospital, and the next day he was back with a cast. Made me feel so bad for him, and a little peeved at his teacher, who had him all day and never even bothered to pay attention to him. Story 18. I could go into so many stories. To say I'm a teacher is a bit of a stretch. I'm an educational backpacking guide for elementary school kids. It's a great program, but the kids we get are handpicked. However, I had a 4th grader who was cutting and tried to hang herself 3 times. The 5th grader who had to kick and lock her mother out of the house to protect the younger sibling. The 4th grader who was talking in very vivid details about sensual acts and trying to get other kids on the trail to act them out. The kid who screamed they did not need CPS in their life and to never call them again. The reason for the call was the kid blatantly told me their mother beat them and had the scars to prove it, one of which looked like a very deep yet healed knife wound. I love my kids. They are tough as nails, and unfortunately, I know what a lot of them see, yet that's what gets a lot of kids to open up to me. There are so many more, but these are the ones I have right now. It's unclear from this story whether the kids are handpicked specifically because of their backgrounds, or if the kids are handpicked by other criteria, and a few of them just happen to come from dysfunctional homes. However, it's worth noting that there actually are wilderness groups for that very cause. In fact, there are all kinds of youth groups offering what they call adventure therapy. Kids go and do physical activities, but they do them as part of a team. They learn things they maybe didn't learn enough of at home, like trust and self-esteem. Those programs aren't necessarily everywhere, but they're highly beneficial, and some are definitely more affordable than others. If you know of a kid who's struggling at home, or who's lashing out against the world and getting themselves on the wrong path, then adventure therapy groups are absolutely worth looking into. Story 19. Had a little boy who one day was crying in the bathroom. I went to assist him, only to discover his rectum was bleeding profusely. He explained he didn't want to play the game with Mommy before school today, and Mommy made him, and he got hurt. Not only did he have autism, but he had a small younger sibling who had no idea what was happening was not normal. We had to call CPS, but Mom still came to pick him up that day from school, and we couldn't stop her. It came out that the mom had been assaulting both kids, and Dad had no idea. That one haunts me to this day. Update. We called CPS and the police and the father that day. The police said they would look into it along with CPS, but could not come and get the children. It ended up that the mother confessed to the father after he became watchful of the mother and questioned her. They obviously are divorced now, and he has sole custody of both children. Story 20. I had a kid who told me, "I'm not allowed to tell you. They'll take me away again," when I asked him about the marks on his body. It turns out that this wasn't the first time his family had been involved in abuse allegations. He had been taken away from his parents and put into foster care the year before, until his foster parents said they didn't want him anymore. So he ended up back in his original home, due to lack of foster homes. After this incident, I reported it, as it's the law, and I heard that one of his parents admitted in a meeting with CPS that the marks were cigarette burns. He still stayed in his abusive home after that. There was a ton of emotional abuse too, but this situation really made me realize how many kids are in awful situations and don't get out of them because of the lack of resources. Story 21. Had a student who was a foster kid. He had severe emotional disabilities. I started noticing how he would go around to all of the other students at lunch and beg them for their food they didn't eat. He would also flip the frick out when you told him you were calling his foster mom. And by flip out, I mean throw desks and whatever else he could get his hands on. I mentioned all of this to the guidance counselor. Come to find out, when the kid got in trouble at school, which was literally every day, the foster mom wouldn't feed him that night. DSS came in and took all of the woman's kids, 10 of them. She flipped out about not receiving a check for the kids anymore. Never heard anything else about it since then. No idea where the kid ended up. The biggest question isn't even where the kid ended up, but whether all 10 were given any way of keeping in touch with each other. It seems doubtful this woman was using this one boy's disciplinary problems as the only way to save money on food. You'd assume she was similarly mistreating at least a few of the other 9 kids. And you'd also assume that, if so, those kids were practically their own emotional support system. Maybe some of them, after going through something like that, would never want another reminder, but some of them might really value any kind of relationship they had between each other that kept them going. It's good they were taken out of that house, but the fact that probably meant splitting them all up in the end is a pretty unfortunate side effect. Story 22. I'm a teacher now, but I've worked with kids since I was a teenager. Summer camp counseling and after-school programs, etc. I live in an area with a high immigrant population, mostly from China. We've had a lot of issues related to cultural differences and child discipline. There was a little girl who would get locked in her basement with no food or water if she was bad at school. When ACS finally got involved, the parents broke down. They didn't know that wasn't allowed in the States, and that was how they had been disciplined as children. I have the little girl's younger sister in my after-school program, and it's so obvious the parents have changed. My school hosts parenting workshops in different languages now to teach about what's acceptable and what's not. A lot of parents actually come too, which is heartening. Story 23. I was a counselor at a before and after school program. I had this one girl that had really bad anger problems and a not so good upbringing. Her parents were put in jail and she was put up for adoption. Her adoptive family wouldn't acknowledge anything she said. We figured they just wanted her for the money they got for adopting. They would ignore any picture she drew them. Everyone treated this girl like she was a freak because of her anger problems. One day, she colored me a picture and signed it and gave it to me. I left the job, but I won't ever get rid of that picture. Story 24. I once looked after a girl whose dad used to get her to help him with his penis juice, her phrasing, and I was asking what she was doing with her family for Christmas. She said she was really hoping to see her dad this year, and it absolutely broke my heart that she couldn't understand why what he had done to her was so bad. Also, I had to control myself whenever her mom came in, because when the abuse came to light, all she cared about was whether she would be going to jail, since she'd known all along. I think about the girl at least once a week, and I really hope she has a happy and fulfilling life, because she really deserves one. Reading this reminded me of a milder, but still distressing moment from my early educational career. I was a summer camp counselor at a high-end summer day camp. I was working on / had finished, forgot exact timeline, my degree in psychology, and one of my students was exhibiting the classic signs of childhood depression. Very intelligent, extreme frustration with peers who couldn't keep up, withdrawal into books and other non-social activities, anger / rage issues, and a few others. I told the director, who also had training in psych and brought our concerns to his parents. They laughed in my face. I really hope he got the help he needed. Here's a fun fact about a lot of mood disorders. When you attempt linking them to other traits, such as intelligence, you will indeed find many studies supporting a relationship between the two. However, you'll find about an equal number of sources suggesting the exact opposite. So while there are indeed countless sources claiming a link between high IQ and depression, there are also studies showing that those with depressive symptoms will often score lower on cognitive testing. To be fair, even if the kid's not depressed, he could still have other mood disorders based on this OP's observations. But it's impossible to predict how the parents might have reacted if OP had simply told them about how their son was acting instead of trying to make a diagnosis. Something absolutely nobody would take seriously coming from a day camp counselor. Finishing up a psychology degree does not make you a psychologist. Acting like it does is exactly why people crack jokes about psych majors. And in this case, that sense of egotism might have gotten in the way of actually helping someone. Story 26. I once saw a student beaten in the street outside of school at dismissal. The student had forgotten his backpack at home. The mom was upset that she had to bring it to him, so she beat him with a belt as he walked, in front of all his friends and all the other parents and teachers. She was screaming, "You embarrass me, now I embarrass you." We ran after her and called the police and social services. The child stayed in the home. He was in 2nd grade. I still get choked up every time I think about it. One of the greatest regrets of my life. I didn't move fast enough. I stood in frozen horror for a moment before acting. It was terrible. Story 27. Had a quiet, small ELL student, 7-year-old Asian girl, I met with a few times a week trying to teach her English. She didn't show up a few times, so I went and inquired where she was. Her father had beaten her lifeless with a belt buckle. Mom knew it was happening and did nothing. By morning, she had passed away due to internal injuries. Both parents went to prison. It sucks that it took the child literally passing away for any sort of justice to be done. You have to wonder what kind of abuse the kid endured without anyone knowing. There's not quite enough information here to justify that last bit. This may have been the first time she was abused, at least in that fashion. Remember that nearly every abuse victim was, at some point, unharmed. It always starts somewhere. If the place it starts is with a heavy metal object, it might also end there. It's also really easy to say from the comfort of a keyboard that the mom is a horrible person for doing nothing. It's easy to assume that if we were in the same shoes, we'd be the heroes. Yet in the story above, several adults watched a child being beaten with a belt and did nothing. With heroes in seemingly such short supply, we don't get to assume we'd be one without being in the situation. In this case, the situation was that a mother watched her child being hurt and had no method of intervening that wouldn't put her in the same crosshairs. It's possible she didn't care, but if she did, what does she do about it? If she steps in and loses her own life in the process of doing so, who looks after the child then? Fear would cripple any number of people in those circumstances. There's every chance of that being what happened here. And if it was, then it's actually messed up for her to be in prison for it. Story 28. Preschool teacher here. Had a little girl who touched herself at nap time every single day. Like really into it, and really consumed into it. It was getting very consistent, and would do it while at the table after a while too. So I asked her why she felt the need to do it, and she literally said, with a smile, because she thought it was so normal and cool, "Oh, well, my daddy does it to me too, and he said I could." I called CPS immediately. Story 29. I volunteered at a small religious school in Central Africa when I was in high school. There was one kid who had an infection in his scalp. You could literally smell it and see the fungus and eggs of some kind whenever he was in the room. It could have been taken care of so easily when it started, but no one loved him enough to do it. This actually sounds a lot like another story I've heard of impoverished people in Africa. What's unclear in this story is why the religious school didn't do anything. Don't most schools have rudimentary medical supplies? The kind you could at least use to treat an infection? If OP knows that it could have been taken care of when it started, then presumably someone saw it when it started. And if we are blaming the lack of treatment he received on the fact that no one loved him, then it suggests by extension that no one at the religious school cared much for him either. This entire thread is full of horrible stories where a child needed care and the parents did nothing. But there's also an unfortunate number of stories where bystanders looked on and did equal amounts of nothing. And then they posted the story on Reddit for upvotes. We have more than enough people who spend every day complaining about the world while passing up any opportunities they actually get to change it. Don't be one of them. Please leave your stories in the comments. I'd love to make a video of them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.